give Lloyd much of an introduction. Very, very quickly, I'll tell you the whole story himself, that he's been working at this since 1999, and you know, it's an incredible story, and I think, you know, we're getting to the point now where we're going to get some real concrete results, and it's like a lot of the stuff we've shown today, it is going to change the world, and I think that hopefully there's a few people in the room who are going to go away from today thinking, oh no, you know, I'm really going to have to change the way I think about the world. And I hope it's not causing too many people too many problems. But without any more ado, I'll go to Lloyd.
I've known Andrew now for about 10 years. He's a good friend. We've been together many times. I've spent nights in his house and everything. And I understood about 10 words of what he just said, if I understood that much. That's how it sounded to me. As you all know, you're here. I hope you know that you're here to hear about the Starchild skull and the latest evidence and all that. So we're going to start with what on earth is a Starchild. You've all read this by now. This is a comparison of a human, Starchild, human. And what we're going to go through is why he had not seen anything like it and nobody else has either. Anyway, all right, the Starchild was found in Mexico about 1930, 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, which is this area right here, Chihuahua. And El Paso actually sits, it's not here, it sits right here, right across the border. And a teenage girl from El Paso, Texas, whose family were Mexicans who had come from a little village in this area to become American citizens. And when they went back for the first time, she was like 12, 13, 14, 15. She couldn't remember in later life exactly how old she was, a teenager. And when they went back, the villagers told them in this little small village, told her and her siblings, do not go, one thing you don't do, don't go in the caves and the mine tunnels of this area. It's dangerous. It's, you know, it's verboten. Just don't do it. It's forbidden. It's taboo. Well, you know, teenager, what are you going to do? Snuck away as soon as she could, figure a way to do that, with a basket, pretending to go out to pick berries and things. And in fact, she was going to look to see if she could find herself a cave or a mine tunnel. And way away, she scooted way, way away from the village to be safe, and she found a mine tunnel. And it looked something like, it's a high desert area like you all know from the Grand Canyon, pictures from the Grand Canyon in Arizona and all that. Same thing, high desert, and a mine tunnel like this where people are living in it now, you know, very poor people of course, but that something that would look like that, just imagine it. And as she went into the mine tunnel, she saw a body laying on the ground, a human body like that. It turned out to be a human female, skeleton, full skeleton, about 5 feet tall, lying on the dirt. Got a little closer and she noticed there was kind of a mound beside it that struck her as a grave. And so she got a little closer and she saw that what she called a misshapen hand, and that's the only word we have, a misshapen hand, was emerged from the dirt and was entangled, wrapped around the arm of the one laying on the dirt. Now, she didn't know the things that are obvious about that scene, which is that the one in the dirt had died, and she, for whatever reason, had lugged this body, which the girl said was significantly smaller than she was. She, according to the size of the skull, of her skull, is about 5 feet tall, which is very standard for Mexicans to this day. To this day. But what we found with carbon-14 testing is that they had died 900 years ago. 900 years ago. Carbon-14 dated, showed that individually they had died at the same time, basically in the same place. So little doubt that what the girl was saying was probably true based on that. So if it was significantly smaller, we have assumed it was about 4 feet tall, whatever it was, even though its skull is the same size in physical dimensions as her skull. So back to the story. 900 years ago, they died. But of course she didn't know that, or that the woman had died, laid down with it. She had buried it, laid down beside it, wrapped the hand around her arm and committed suicide. For whatever reason, whatever way. So, very dramatic story, obviously, just based on what she saw. Well, what she decided to do was see if she could scrape it out and see where the hand led. So she did, because there was no, it's in a mine tunnel, there's no compaction from rain or anything like that. The grave was as fresh and crumbly as when it was laid down there. So she scraped with her own hands and exposed that full skeleton that she said was smaller. She ended up, it's a long story about how she ended up with the skull. She tried to recover both skeletons, lost most of the parts in a flood, in a rainstorm, but ended up with the two skulls slightly damaged, minus their jaws, because a skull is not attached to its jaw. And she ended up with the upper parts of the skulls, again damaged a little bit, and she just kept them as souvenirs for the rest of her life. For the rest of her life. As she was dying in the early 90s and knew she was, her husband, who was a Border Patrol agent, was not comfortable with having a couple of skulls in a cardboard box in the garage, and she knew that. So she passed them on to some friends. He was an FBI agent. He wasn't that, and this is not from an illegal standpoint. It was just from a kind of creepy standpoint. He just, they weren't comfortable with it. So they had friends, next slide, Ray and Melanie Young of El Paso. All these people live in El Paso. Ray and Melanie, Melanie had been a neonatal nurse for about 15 years, working with, children. And so she knew a lot about deformity. She had seen a lot of deformity. She had studied a lot about deformity. So, and when they asked, would you take this one skull that's normal and the other one is deformed, would you be okay with that? And she said, yeah, sure. Keeping in mind that up until then, anybody that knew anything about these skulls assumed that the strange looking one was just a human deformity. That's what everybody said, and so that's what everybody assumed. But Melanie had the schooling and the experience to know immediately, no, that's not a human deformity. It's too light, it's too symmetrical, all the parts are different. This just isn't what human deformity looks like. She knew immediately. Not only that, her and Ray were just coincidentally members of El Paso MUFON, Mutual UFO Network. They were fans, like you, of UFO, alien sorts of things. And so they went to the meetings regularly and they kept up with it. And so Melanie said, not only is this skull not a human deformity, I'm sure, it looks to me like it's got all of the physical traits and hallmarks of a standard gray alien. Now, for those of you who don't know what a gray alien is, I bet you know when I describe it. It's that alien that you see with the kind of little mounds up here in the top of the head with the crease down the middle and the very narrow lower face. That's called a heart-shaped face. People that see them say they have like a heart-shaped face and they got these weird black eyes, That's your standard gray alien. So she looked at it and she says to Ray, I think this is the skull of a gray alien. They decided to find out there in El Paso from experts there, and they took it to a few experts, and each of those experts told them the same thing. Well, it's flat in back, so that means it was cradle boarded, and it's got this swelling in the parietals, and that means it had water on the brain. So it's just a hydrocephalic. It's cradle boarded hydrocephalic. Take it home, forget about it. Put it in the blender and forget about it, or throw it. Just forget about it. Nothing important, nothing unusual, nothing unique. Well, Melanie knew better, but she couldn't get past the initial wall that was thrown up and that I have dealt with for years and am still dealing with. That was the first foray, the first shots fired against that wall were fired in El Paso. So they went to the next MUFON meeting and they said, look, we're getting nowhere with this. Who in the field of alternative knowledge talks about skulls, knows anything about skulls? And somebody said, well, there's this guy in New Orleans named Lloyd, and I've seen him do a lecture and he talks a lot about skulls, because I was dealing with, at that point, hominoids and human origins. That was my field. And so I was indeed talking a lot about skulls. And so they said, okay, so they contacted me and they said, the next time you're in the El Paso area, would you come by? And we have something we think you'd really want to see. And so I said, sure. People would, show me interesting things all the time. I never said no if it wasn't out of my way. Why not, So I went by El Paso February 18th, 1999. And that's when I saw them for the first time. They pulled those skulls out of the box. And I have to tell you, it really amazed me just like it did Melanie, because I knew enough to know I was looking at something very unusual. I did not, however, believe that it was an alien. I didn't agree with her because I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't wrap my head around it right away. that this was possible, although I said it's probably some kind of deformity or combination of deformities that we just don't know anything about, some really rare exotic malady. And she says, well, it's nothing I've ever heard of, and I've been researching now for a couple of months, and I can't find anything. And I said, well, give me a chance to find out, but I will take it around. I think there's a possibility that it could be what you think. It certainly is unique, and let's find out. And so that was the start of this almost 14-year odyssey to get it to this point, without having any inkling at that time that that was what it was going to amount to turn into this ordeal that it's turned into. But nonetheless, we're going to win, and that's what counts. All right, next slide. Here we start now with the analysis, the technical analysis of it, so you'll come to understand why it's so unique. All the combinations of points of view that you can see, there's nothing that looks the same. There are 25 major physical differences and several minor. Okay, so there's not a single point of reference in the human skull. Nothing you can say that is exactly the same in the Starchild. Nothing. And not only that, the Starchild has some things in it, as you'll see, that is not found in anything else of any kind, any species at all. Next slide. The human, the Starchild. And it starts with this frontal view, and we see the eye sockets, but these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. All humans have brow ridges. All primates have brow ridges. You know, that little lump around our brows that our eyeballs sit under. Their eye sockets sit under. A little protective shield there a little bit. Starchild does not have that at all. This here, if you put your finger in there in the eye socket, anywhere around it, it has kind of a roundness to it. It feels kind of like a drinking straw, the width of a drinking straw and the shape and smoothness of it. If you do that to the Starchild, it comes right to a point. It's not a blade like it's going to cut you, but it comes right to an edge, like a dull edge. Absolutely different. In here, you see the nose, a human nose comes down off of the brow ridge in a little dip. Everybody's got that, even if you have a big nose. And then your nose is narrow at the top and it widens out as it comes down. Everybody does that. This is totally different. It's absolutely straight, and it's the same width here as it is here right on down. Different, different, different. Even at subtle levels, there's nothing is the same. Now, if you see, next slide, the profile view, what you find is that this is 2 inches deep. That's 2 knuckles deep. If I put my finger in, that's where it goes to. Do that to the Starchild, it's less than ½ an inch. It's about that much. A completely different eye socket and a completely different eye. There's no way an eyeball like we have that is bigger in the back and bigger on the bottom so that it'll stay in the head when we get hit. Our eye, what we see is a small part of what's back there, so it'll stay in our heads. This, if it had an eyeball like us in there, it would be sticking out to there, right? Can't have that. I wanted to point out, if you would go back, the brow ridge and the dip and the absolute lack of both over here. Next slide now. Pterygoids, ear holes, and Indians. When you look at the Starchild by itself, people would always say, what are these 2 little bones sticking out here? Nobody understood what they were. I didn't either before I learned this. This is called the pterygoid plate, and its sole job is to brace this, the upper maxilla, the upper jaw, and protect it so that if you get hit here in the face by anything, a punch or a fall or whatever, this will not just break off and go right in here and kill you. That's what the pterygoid plates do. They're actually very important parts of the skull. Ear holes right here, you see that the Starchilds are shifted forward quite a bit, and we'll talk about that more. But the point here, the real point is the Indians. If you are a creature with a head on a neck, you have a knot of some point in the back of your head where your neck connects to. With humans, it's this thing right here. Feel your own. Everybody's got one. It's called the inion, or external occipital protuberance. They call it inion for short. Various sizes. Everybody's got one. Various positions. If you've got a head on a neck, you can have it up here. You can have it down here, but you've got one. Starchild does not have one where it's supposed to. If it's a human, it's got, in fact, an indentation. Its actual one is down about right here because it has a very tiny neck, a small neck, less than half of the volume of our neck, as we'll see in another slide. Next slide. Top view, standard curve of a human head. Everybody knows how that works. And then you have this crease here that makes the crease in the heart-shaped face. Now, also too, you need to understand about sutures. These are sutures. These are parietal bone, frontal bone. And sutures are in all skulls. When you're born, you have this area of bone and this area of bone and this area of bone, but all this in between is very stout ligament, which allows a baby, an infant's head, to reshape, to pass out the birth canal, and then it'll come out and it'll pull itself very shortly back into the size that it's going to take. And then what happens over the next 2 years is these sutures close all around, and the last place to close is this one here, which is called the fontanelle, which is the soft spot, at about age 2. And then the suturing is finished. So the Starchild is clearly, sutured up pretty good, as is this. Next slide. Now, here's the back view. Now, this is what we all look like. This is the occipital bone here. Again, the parietals, and this is the suture line for it and where it connects. This is the inion, the knot that I was just talking to. And these are the fossa where the two big neck muscles come up and attach here. To the two big muscles that attach, but also the neck goes around like this. With the Starchild, as you see, it's like somebody took this and just pulled it up and straightened it out a bit, and a completely different, just redesign back here. And this is where the inion should be, and it's just this dent kind of compression. And this is its real inion, this little bitty nub of a thing right here, and that's its fossa compared to that. You can see how much dramatically reduced it is. Next slide. Balance points of craniums is kind of pretty interesting. In a human, this would be more out here because this is cradle boarded, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The female found with the human was cradle boarded. It's an important point, and we'll talk about it later. But for right now, understand that the balance point in a human neck is at about at the 2/3 from the front, because all this is solid bone and brain, and a lot of this is hollow. You have big frontal sinuses that take up a lot of room here. You have the deep eye sockets, you have the nasal passage, and you have the mouth. So basically the front of our face is hollow, basically. So you've got a fat kid and a skinny kid on the seesaw. Well, you got to move the fulcrum back toward the fat kid so that the skinny kid gets a little more leverage, and that's what you have to have here. And that's what nature has provided us with. A neck set back so that the spine comes in here and it gives us proper balance. Starchild, completely different. Does not have frontal sinuses, as you'll see, as those very shallow eye sockets. We assume very small nose and mouth because everything about it is small. We'll talk about that. So that the balance point had to go forward because you got all this extra brain back here, even though it's flattened out, to give it balance, perfect balance, front and back and side to side. Now why? Because it's got that skinny little neck down here that we're going to talk about. Balance is really important for something that is like a weird shaped golf ball on a tee. Now, you guys play cricket here. It's baseball in the States, but the same principle holds. You take a cricket bat, and you hold it in your hand by the handle with the bat part of it sticking straight up. I mean, absolutely straight up, vertical. If you do that and you hold it, it's not that hard to hold it. You'd be surprised, not that hard to hold it. You tip it off even 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and as you start doing that, it'll just pull you over because gravity takes over. But if you can keep it straight up over the center of gravity, gravity works for you. That's how it is with the Starchild, and nature understands that and gave it what it needed to have its head balanced properly on its neck. Now, if it's a deformity, how did nature know to do all these things to make it work? Yeah, right. Anyway, next slide. Now, this is really important to keep in mind. The cerebellum, this thing right here about the size of your fist, sits back here in the base of your neck, and it's extremely well protected. This is some of the thickest, toughest bone in your body, and it's protected by neck muscles as well. The cerebellum is your software. It's your motor. You think and do a lot of things up here, but this is where your blood is constantly moving, your urine is being made, what goes on 24/7 in your body that you're totally unaware of. It never stops. It never sleeps. It's got many more of the neurons and things that it needs in this, to function than this does. This is where we think and do all that stuff, but this is where you really exist. As you know, with Congressman Gabby Giffords, you can take a bullet through the head and live. You can't get a nail pounded into that and live. You got to have this. So it's taken care of. Your body takes care of your cerebellum. What it does is in here, if you could stick your finger in the foramen magnum, you would feel these flanges of bone. And when I take the models and copies around to let people do it, and they'll say, yeah, really there. You can feel these flanges that this thing braces up against to hold it in position, because you got these 3 pounds of this weighing down on it, and it's got to last in place for 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years. It can't slide out. It can't be compressed, because if it is, it'll slide right out the neck hole. It'll slide right out of the foramen magnum around the spine, and you'll die. And in fact, when you have hydrocephalics where you have the pressure increase, that's generally what will kill them. The push of their cerebellum out through the neck hole. With me? Okay, but with Starchild, as you see, we've got a very different situation because of the flattening back here. This has to be more in an oval shape, and you've got so much more brain up here. Now let me mention that. This is a standard 5-foot tall female, standard head, and she's got a 1,200 cubic centimeters of cranial capacity. You pour flaxseed in, fill it up, pour it out, measure it, right at 1,200 cubic centimeters, right about what she's supposed to have. Now all of us in here, except the very smaller people, will sit right in here at the average volume of 1,400 cubic centimeters. Most of us in this room would have about 1,400 cubic centimeters. So 1,400 cubic centimeters sitting here in the middle. Now the Starchild, as I said, is the same physical size, about 13 cubic centimeters. They would both fit in a box about 13 cubic centimeters in volume. And yet, it has stunningly, shockingly, 1,600 cubic centimeters of brain space in there. Pour the flaxseed in there and you hit 1,200 and you keep going, you hit 1,400, you keep going, up to 1,600. It's amazing. 400 more than it ought to have. Where does it fit? We don't know. The bone is much thinner, that's true. A lot of space taken up there, no frontal sinuses, very shallow eye sockets, but you have the expanded parietals, but then you have the flattened rear. We can see maybe 200 more extra. Maybe. Can't see 1,600. Don't really understand how this works. But that's a lot of extra brain weighing down on the cerebellum. That's the point. A lot of extra brain. And guess what? You know those flanges that we have? Doesn't have them. Little bitty nubs down there. Little bitty, the tiniest of little bumps you can feel. So that is, remember the fat kid on the seesaw? The fat kid on the slipper slide going down should have just slid right out the neck hole. Right out. Brain guy said, you know, either this thing doesn't have a cerebellum of the kind that we have, or its brain is a much more dense material than we have, because if that's a human brain, that's coming right out. And don't be surprised to learn that this bone is a lot tougher too. Bone and brain seem to be a lot tougher. Bone is for sure. We have to assume the brain is. Interesting stuff though. Next slide. Neck size and shape, and here we go. We see the normal standard shape of a human neck. It actually peels a little farther around than you can see here, so it's actually even a little bigger. But the Starchild is like this. This is basilar part. This is missing on the Starchild. Nothing unusual about it. That's the last part of the skull to fuse between the age of 20 and 25, but it's also not a particularly good fusion, and so it could have been knocked out in the tumble down the stream that took out the, it took out one cheekbone here on the human and took out both cheekbones in the lower face here on the Starchild. But nonetheless, this shows the difference in the shape and the volume of the neck. Next slide. This is the absent inion that we talked about, and this is the fossa for the Starchild where the muscles connect. And here you see the spread of the fossa, the size of them, and this is the inion where it, here where it should be. And you see very clearly here the difference in the size of the muscles that attach the neck, a very small neck. Next slide. Zygomatic arches, cheekbones. Your jaw, your lower jaw is not attached to your skull. All that holds it to you is your cheek, the cheek muscles that attach up here to your head. Muscles attached to it, go up through the cheekbones, spread out, and attach it to your head. When you die, your jaw becomes disengaged from your skull. Somebody lifts it up, the jawbone stays there, not connected to your head. Next slide. We see that this is the case, and it comes up, and you can see the difference in the texture of the bone where those chewing muscles attach. About half the size in the Starchild as the volume right here. Very clear. Much smaller, much reduced lower face. Next slide. Okay, x-rays show that the Starchild, like any vestige of frontal sinus, and this is the x-ray eye socket, and this is the frontal sinus, and this is the x-ray of the Starchild, and you see there's no vestige, not even a slight thing. Now the first test we had done, first test I was able to arrange was an x-ray test of the Starchild skull and the maxilla. And the x-ray tech that looked at it, he says, oh, well now this is really interesting. Because you can have the sinuses be two different sizes. You can have them be shriveled up, you can have them be, you know, pretty bad looking, but you're always going to see some piece that they attempted to grow. You'll always see vestiges of it. And he says the fact that this thing lacks that, he says that's really unusual. It really is. You ought to look into this kind of thing, which we intended to do. But what's interesting about it is, what do you think your sinuses are for? What do you think they do? You think it has to do with being sick, right? That it somehow helps you clear your, you know, clear up a cold or do whatever your sinuses are, and they deal with hay fever and things like that. It's not true. What your sinuses are there for, and what they do primarily, is they allow your voice to resonate. They allow me to talk to you as I'm talking to you now. Because if I didn't have sinuses, I would sound something like a robot or something like that, like a machine talks, because it can't resonate. That's how it would be. We would all talk like that. So what this tells us is maybe the Starchild had no need to talk. No need to talk. And when people encounter grays, one of the things they always insist is they communicate via telepathy. They don't talk. They communicate. I know what they're thinking, they know what I'm thinking, but they don't talk. And here's evidence that this could be that in action right there. Next slide. Now, this is a CAT scan of the Starchild, but it's just to symbolize to you that the Starchild's inner ears are twice the size of human inner ears. Now, your inner ear is a balance mechanism, and this goes back to the Starchild having that big honking head on that little bitty neck. It probably needs more fine-tuning in the balance to hold it upright. This is what we assume. But it does have inner ears twice the size of human inner ears. Next slide. Exterior surfaces of bone. This is great. Human bone, imagine, all bone looks like this with these little dimples here. Now, what are they? You've all heard the story of your cells change out every 7 years. You know that. All but your brain. Your brain stays the same, but all the other cells in your body change out every 7 years. And it's true, they do. That's the 7-year itch, and the study of the 7-year changes of life in the book Passages and that whole school of thought there, but it is true. So in the Starchild and everything else, humans, excuse me, not in the Starchild, in humans, what would happen is, let's say a cell here. It's here and it starts a journey toward this hole and it moves in here, and within 7 years it's going to go in that hole and it's going to be dissolved and be passed out. Meanwhile, another one of these holes, and you can't tell just looking at them which is which, is going to be pushing new ones up to take the place of the ones going down. And this is going on all the time. And everywhere, in all parts of our body. We are changing out all the time. And after 7 years, my cells don't like yours anymore. I want a divorce. That kind of thing. It is a function that happens. So if that's true, how does the Starchild lose them? If it's a deformity, how does it lose that? Down to that level of detail. Pretty weird. Next slide. Mass spectrometry of the human bone. You have high calcium, high phosphorus, oxygen and carbon down here, and then the others are very low down here. But standard human bone, this is what it looks like. Next slide. Starchild bone. High calcium, high phosphorus, but look, oxygen and carbon way up. What's the difference? It is tooth enamel. This is tooth enamel. The whole skull, all the bone, is like the hardest bone in our bodies, which is our tooth enamel. It is, and our bone is tough, don't get me wrong. Bone, animal bone, human bone, pretty tough stuff. But tooth enamel is the hardest, and the Starchild, because it's very thin relative to human, is much harder. It is tooth enamel, like tooth enamel, chemically. Next slide. Upper right maxilla fragment has a nasal passage and is very small. This is that piece of maxilla that I was talking about, and what that is this part here, from the middle around, this part of your upper jaw, right part, that piece detached. And it used to have 2 teeth, now it only has 1. I had to give this one up for testing, forgive me, but you know, I made mistakes like everybody does. There was no instruction manual when I got this thing. But anyway, here's the nasal passage. So we know that it breathed, it had a breathing mechanism. And what this 1 inch is, don't let that fool you, there was at least another tooth there, at least another one. So it was a little bit more, but it was small. It is small, small mouth. Next slide. And when you double that up, the piece that we have, what we find is the roof is flat, flat. Now what that tells us is it has a very small tongue, a very flat tongue, like a piece of cardboard or something, or no tongue at all. But since its teeth are worn, like it was eating something, I assume that it had a tongue but very flat compared to ours. Something that could just flip the food back or something. But not a tongue like we have for speaking. You know how our tongue is a lot of its use is for speaking because there's just no space for it. The curve of the roof of your mouth is where your tongue fits. So this is another piece of evidence that the Starchild had no need to speak. No need to speak. Next slide. The x-rays of the maxilla fragment with one of the teeth gone shows that you have 5 crowns ready to come down. Now, again, back at that first x-ray in the first week, the guy saw this and he says, well, you got 2 teeth down, you got 5 teeth up in the bone ready to come down. That's a kid. That's 5, 6, 7 years old. That's a kid. So we said, okay, child. And that's how the name Starchild evolved. We believed it was a child. Later we found out with expert help that the teeth were too worn for a child, as you'll see. Next slide. Too much torque has to be applied to chip the enamel like this, to crazy enamel. You get this from cracking walnuts and things like that. I mean, really hard work. This is from eating gritty food made with a mortar and pestle made of stone, like that. So you've got all the, the chipping, and you can see the different chips here and the crazing. And it's just not, children can't generate that torque. They just can't do it. They don't have the teeth in their mouths long enough to do that. And plus this is an adult root. When this is the tooth that was pulled out, you can see when a child's tooth comes out, all this is dissolved. You know how they come out and you put it under the pillow and it's just that little part there. So it's just not a child. It was star adult, but once we called it Starchild, that name has stuck. And that's what it's going to go down in history as, the Starchild. Next slide. How the skulls look now after removal of bone for testing, and this just to let people know how much we've had to cut out of it, and there's also about that much gone out of the backsides. Not the human. Every time we test the human, we get what we want the first time, so it's much less damage, but with the Starchild, they don't get what they want, so they keep cutting, trying to find it, and you have to cut that much more out of it. Next slide. How does mainstream science explain the Starchild? They explain it very simply. Nature can do anything. Nature can do this. It can make a tiger rabbit if it wants to. Nature can do anything. In the same way, when you back a religious person into a corner about religious questions, they'll always back into God can do anything. You can't beat me, God can do anything. Well, science is exactly the same way. You can't beat me because nature can do anything. With all these things that I've been showing you, these physical differences, they mean absolutely nothing to mainstream science. All they do is they just say, sorry, nature can do anything. A guy, I got in an argument, I was pushing him a little bit to answer questions that he had no answer for, and he finally just said, look, I don't care if you stack up 10,000 of those differences. 10,000, doesn't matter. All I have to do is say nature can do anything. Why are you even bothering me? Why are you wasting my time? Why are you wasting your time? Why don't you just go home and forget about it? You can't prove what you're saying. You can't prove it. And in terms of physical differences, he's right. He was right. There's no way to overcome the other side. Why? Because the game I'm trying to play with them is in their hometown, on their home field, in their home stadium, with nothing but their people in the stands.
And the rate terms.
And their ball, their rules, and their referees. And you got to suit up and play that game if you're in my position and the position of others like me. It's really, really hard. It's really, really hard because they control the media. They control the belief system. They have the best PR in the world, and they make everybody believe that people like me don't know one end from the other about anything. That they know everything and we don't know anything. It's very, very hard to compete. This is how they get away with it. Nature can do anything. Next slide. So these are 10 experts who officially state that the Starchild is not a deformity, and there's more down here. But the point is, all of these guys have studied it, have held it in their hands, have had time to analyze it, and have made a proclamation that they've allowed to be put on the Starchild Project website. This has been there since about 2002, 2003, something like that. And yet, to this day, you don't see any of the criticism out there talking about this. All the criticism that you see on the internet, particularly Wikipedia, is by people who have never seen it at all. Never seen it, never studied it, never done anything. They write from the position of omnipotence. I have a PhD and I know better than everybody. I don't need to see it. I don't need to see it. I know what it is. It's a deformity. Because everything I've ever learned tells me that this is supposed to be a deformity. And anything that's not a deformity is not allowed in our current paradigm, so I will defend the current paradigm to the death. And that's how they do. And so everything that you will read about the Starchild on the internet, and particularly Wikipedia, is nothing but lies. Just absolute garbage. And they know better. They know we have the evidence. All they have to do is go to the website. We have tons of information that contradicts everything that they have. And yet, you still read that garbage on the internet. And people all think, the first thing they do when they meet me and they start learning about this is they run home and they read what Wikipedia has to say about it. And they say, oh, that guy's lying. That guy's a fraud. That guy's a hoaxer. Because they believe Wikipedia. And let me tell you something about Wikipedia. You have the belief that it's written by people who know what they're talking about. Okay? If you want to read about how to shoe a horse, you're reading it from somebody who does know what he's talking about. But if you're reading about it, something to do with alternative knowledge, which is what I and many others do, what you're reading there is a bunch of absolute lies. And those are orchestrated by what are called administrators, who are generally graduate students somewhere in the world with time on their hands, and they take responsibility for various aspects that they're interested in. We've had 5 that I think I'm aware of over the last 12 or so years with the Starchild, or as long as it's been on Wikipedia. And what they do is they have a thing that allows their computer to know that somebody's made a change. And they'll go in and they'll fix it back to the way they want it. So you can try your best. I offer this challenge to anyone. Go in, make a change, a positive change about it, and within a few hours it'll be changed back to the way it was. And by me doing this over the years, it's turned out, somebody contacted me not too long ago and he said, you know, I heard you say this on a radio show, and I didn't believe it because I do a lot of work within Wikipedia, and I just wanted to see. I checked your Starchild website. They keep great records. All the changes that have ever been made, they keep. And he said, I looked at your page, and he says, I have to tell you, I was really impressed. There have been more changes, pro and con, on your Starchild page. More people trying to write good things about it, and more corrections from the other side than on the page of ex-President George W. Bush. Now, that is good company of scoundrels. I mean, that is. So I take pride in that I'm that far under their skin that they have to watch it that diligently. But they do. That is the way it is. Next slide. What they say is that still to this day, you will still read cradle-boarded hydrocephaly, and now the new one, progeria. It used to be just cradle-boarded and hydrocephaly, and that stood because they could get away with it. But I've hammered them so bad at things like this, as you'll see, that a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, they came up with that one, and you'll see why. I'm going to go over each one now. Next slide. Cradle boarding, you all know, I hope you know, is the practice of primitive societies where you put a baby on a board to put on the mother's back in societies where the women have to work very diligently within a few days of birth. They put the baby back there, they swaddle it, and they have to strap the head down lightly, not crunch it down, just lightly strap it down so that it won't snap around like that as she works and damage its neck. Just hold it down. But because the bone is so soft over the time that it has to stay on the cradle board, it is going to flatten out as flat as the board. And the human that was found with the Starchild 900 years ago, very common, she was cradle boarded. And her back of her head is absolutely as flat as that table, about the size of the palm of my hand. It always starts right at the top of the inion. Can't go below the inion because you can't tear neck muscles off. It has to stop right there, and it stops up at the crown, and that's how it is. And flat as that. So it has to be flat. I'm sorry. Go ahead, next slide. You're right. So with the Starchild, what we see is that it isn't flat. It's got its natural convolutions. You can see them in this shot, and you can see them especially here. And if you ran your hand over it, you'd feel the natural convolutions of the bone, which bone normally has. It was never put up against a board. I mean, never. Morons and even sub-morons, poorly performing morons, can see this and understand this. But your average PhD cannot. Cannot. Next slide. Again, cradle boarded head positions. This is when it's standard, no cradle boarding, when they're both looking ahead. This is the angles of their heads. But now this one, if it's cradle boarded up against the board, kicking back, mom's working, catching some rays, no problem. Everything's fine. Starchild, Mom, please. Oh. Dead in about 3 minutes from strangling. Never happened. I mean, again, sub-level morons can see this. And yet you will go right out on the internet and you'll find them saying that this is it. Cradle-boarded hydrocephalic. Next slide. Hydrocephaly, as you know, I hope, is called water on the brain. It's not water, it's fluid, spinal fluid. Normally, your spinal fluid comes up, washes out your brain of things, cells that have gone bad. Again, 7 years, everything but the brain, but there are parts of it that do need to be refreshed. And then it comes out through tubes that take it back and it goes out, constantly cycling through. But if these tubes are clogged or in some way impaired, it won't go out, and it just keeps blowing until you die. Till the pressure gets such that it squeezes the cerebellum out of the neck hole, and that's it. This is invariably a death sentence, especially 900 years ago. Today, I mean, this is like a third world country, because today, just anybody that's born with it, it's a pretty easy fix to put shunts in there and allow them to go on. There are people, you don't even know what happened to them, generally. It's so easy to fix now. But again, not in all countries. But if it isn't fixed, and this is what you get, it's going to expand at the sutures. The sutures are not going to come together because that's the weakest point. They're not connected. It's easy to see. Next slide. And same thing, blowing up a balloon, you're not going to be able to put a crease in it. And the sutures are all together. Sub-performing morons can see this. The PhDs can't. You will still see them saying this is the answer to the Starchild. Next slide. If that suture is fused, you can get a crease. If it's abnormally fused, meaning just smoothed over fused. But you can put a camera, as we did up in here, to see this from the inside, and you can see the light shining through. Absolutely perfectly normal sutures all the way around. And they know it. Look, it's not like they don't know it. It's not like they don't know it. We're on that field playing that game. That's what it is. And they're trying to win. Even though they know what they're doing is cheating, they want to win. And so they just pretend that this is true, when they know good and well it's not. Next slide. Last but not least, vein tracts. When your brain has veins on top of it, and when you're an infant, your bone is so soft it touches on those and the veins leave tracks. Everybody's like this. And the Starchild has them too. Now they're repositioned in the Starchild because it has a different kind of brain, a different shape, different everything about it, but it still had veins on its brain, and it shows clearly that it didn't have fluid on its brain, separating the brain from the skull. Morons at work. Next slide. Now, the new one is, because of just how devastating that argument is against them, one of them noticed, Wait a minute. The Starchild has thin bone and progeria victims have thin bone. And the Starchild has a lower face, a small lower face, and progeria victim. It's got to be progeria victim. We win. Yay, progeria victim. Starchild is a progeria victim. Well, sure enough, the Starchild bones are thin relative to humans, but progeria is that horrible disease where when you're born, you immediately start getting old. And if you make it to 15, you've lived the equal of about 100. Most of them don't make it to 15. It's a terrible, terrible disease across a lot of areas, a lot of problems. But what it is mostly is you're shriveling up and dying right out of the chute. So that your bones are always very fragile because they're so thin and so weak and so brittle. Next slide. Now the Starchild, sure enough, you see how much thinner it is. It's dramatic. Half or less than half. But certainly in the same area here, it's less than half. And yet, it's 2 to 3 times as hard. It's much harder. When you cut these bones, if you take a saw blade and to make this bone cut right here, a saw blade, you just go zoom, 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 zoom. It'll take you about 50 strokes to make that. Human bone's not, you can see it's not thin and it's not easy to cut through. It'll take you about 50 strokes to make that length right there. To make the same length on the Starchild, take you about 200. It's like cutting sheet metal by comparison. You don't even know you're making progress for a while. Really amazing, that tooth enamel thing, and something else that's coming up later. But you can see very clearly, this is not fragile bone. This is not progeria victim. Next slide. Now, sure enough, lower face, reduced lower face, and you'll see this in a minute too. But it's still human. Look at where the ears are, right at the eyes where it's supposed to be. Look at where the ears are here, not even in the ballpark. Still human eyes, brow ridges, dip in the nose, human eyeballs in there. So it's shriveled up, yes, but it's still a human being. The parts that aren't really badly affected are still human parts. Next slide. And you see if in profile, brow ridge, no brow ridge, nose dip, no nose dip, and lack of chin, very reduced because it just never gets to grow. Little thin neck, but still has the inion back here and all this. It's still just not the same. It's a human. It's a badly deformed, badly impacted human, but human nonetheless. Starchild is not a progeria victim. Next slide. And last but not least, progeria victims almost never have the fontanelle close, and of course the Starchild did. Again, sublevel morons, anybody can see this. Anybody that's a true scientist would be ashamed to try to say that the Starchild is a victim of cradle boarding, hydrocephaly, or progeria. And yet you go out there and that's the criticism that you will read. Next slide. So how do they explain it away? None of the above is true. None of the above. Next slide. And if it's not a combination of what are these things, what was it? Next slide. Well, the first image we look at is by an Alaskan artist named Rob Roy Menzies, who said, look, if I take your x-ray and I put a face on it, it looks pretty cool, don't you think? And I said, well, yeah, pretty cool, except you make it look like somebody killed its dog. Can you fix that? Make it look a little more appealing. And so in the end, next slide, we got out this, which I think is really a pretty good depiction of how it probably looked. And understand with the eyes, this. With the Starchild's eyes, with that very, very shallow depth of its eye sockets, it can't have a ball like us. That would pop off the head like frog eyes. You can't make it through childhood with eyes like that. You have to have a greatly flattened in eye that sits there and really probably can't move. There's no way. Like we can get 180 degrees of vision by looking left, looking right, but our eyes move because they're round balls in a big socket that holds them. This, in order to get 180 degrees of vision, is going to have to be all pupil, wall-to-wall pupil, so that it takes in more. But in taking in more, you got to have a bigger brain back there to deal with all that it's taking in more. A lot of our brain works to take care of our vision, right? Starchild has all that. So I go along with this idea. Now, the standard gray idea of eyes here is very likely, I think, some kind of a lens that they have to wear over when they're on Earth to deal with Earth light or Earth dark, maybe so they can see it in the night, because you generally always are dealing with them in the night. Not that many encounters in the day. Some, but vastly more at night. So it's possible that those are lenses that allow them to see at night or whatever, but I think it's a lens sitting over the eye. Now, this communion picture, this has become the iconic image of gray aliens because of the Whitley Strieber book, the cover of the Whitley Strieber book. But in fact, and Bud Hopkins and others who deal with this will tell you, this is not what people say when they've really seen them. Bud says this is much more like what they describe. They don't describe this. They describe something much more like that. Bud Hopkins himself told me that before he died. It's pretty interesting. Next slide. Now, this is a forensic sculptor. People would say, well, has anybody ever tried to make one of those clay models of the Starchild? And so we finally got a forensic sculptor, Bill Munns, to do it. And this is what he sent me. And I said, Bill, geez, man, those eyes, those are human eyes. It can't be the Starchild's eyes. He says, yeah, I know. Couldn't make it work, Lloyd. They just stuck off the head and it was just terrible. I said, well, what'd you do? He said, we don't have a format for that, any kind of a template for it. I said, what'd you do? He says, well, I had to cut the eyeball right in half. You know, the eyeballs that they put in there, I had to cut it in half to make it fit. And he said, and then it was okay. And I said, oh, well, all right. And I said, what about the neck? What are all these big things out to the side? And he says, well, if you do the neck the real size of it, he says, you got this big honking lump of clay up on this skinny little neck. He said, if I bumped it against the table or something, the head might just fall off the neck. So I had to brace it up a little bit. And I said, oh, okay, all right. Well, that made sense too. But I mean, other than that, though, it's a pretty reasonable, pretty good look, I think. Next slide. And you'll see how he put it together, and you'll see those half eyes in there, and you'll watch the process of him putting it together, which is really pretty cool. Next slide. And we'll do it again because it's so much fun.
I've watched a forensic sculpture. There's only one thing, they put little wood pins and
Right.
they build it up to a certain depth in different layers.
Some do it that way, and others...
Put in the little wood pins.
Well, nobody knows what the wood things, what they would be, but I asked him about that, and he says, no, the oldest of us do it this way. The youngest of us have learned in college to do it the new way. But he said it's the same effect. I mean, it looks good to me, other than those things. Okay, next slide. Now, this is from a guy named Chris Murphy, who, I don't know how many of you are interested in hominoids like Bigfoot and the Abominable Snowman and all that, but he does the best books and some of the best literature, but particularly the best books about that subject. And he does analysis of hominoid faces relative to human faces, and he did this with the Starchild. It turns out that our faces are very well proportioned. From here to our chin, our eyes are in the middle. From our eyes to our chin, our nose is in the middle. From our nose to our chin, our mouth is in the middle. It just divides down like that. It's really pretty cool. Starchild, nothing like that. Very different in each case. Now, people have said, well, could the Starchild, something like the Starchild, if it made an effort, could it disguise itself and walk around among us? Can there be aliens walking among us, or at least Starchild people? And so I posed this challenge to my assistant Vivian, and here's what she came up with. Next slide. And boy, it's like, well, maybe, golly. Could happen. Anyway, next slide. Two things found in the Starchild bone are not found in bones of any other creature on Earth. Unknown fibers, unknown red residue. Understand what I'm saying here. No other creature on Earth. You're going to see something that's not found in anything. Two things that's found in the Starchild. Next slide. This is the cut of a Dremel blade. A Dremel blade is a blade, a whirling round blade, and a deal that you cut the bone with, and you go, whoop, you cut the bone. And if I were to have one here, it could cut my hand off my wrist in just a matter of a few seconds. It would go through. Do not screw around with a Dremel blade. Tough. So when they cut some of the first pieces of bone out, not the first pieces, but some of the first pieces, but they looked under with a little chip with a scanning electron microscope, the person said, what is all this? What is all this? What is all this? Well, what is it? We don't know. So you never see this. This is incredible. How could it resist the Dremel blade? Well, it turns out that these are fibers. Next slide. These fibers are woven into the matrix of the bone. Here you see one of them where the blade passed just over where it lays in that track right there, like rebar in concrete, to add strength to the bone that's already super hard. Because these fibers are really, really durable. You can see that one's torn, but somehow this one came along here, it got ripped out of its track and came out here and got wrapped around this fatter one here. They're different kinds. They're different kinds of fibers. And we've had a check from with mycologists. It's not anything that grew on it or grew there. It's not fungi, bacteria, mold, anything like that. It's in the bone. It's in the matrix of the bone. It's woven in, not known in any other animal species on Earth, as far as we know. Next slide. We see another one here, the flat fiber snagged down here, and another kind, but what you see here up close is it's sheared off. The Dremel blade, it resisted the Dremel blade to the degree that it tore it off instead of cut it through like it would do my arm. Tough stuff, whatever this is. Next slide. And here we see one absolutely clearly buried in the matrix right up at the surface of the inner part of the bone. What is it? Don't know. Next slide. Now, bone chips cut but not polished. When you cut, the bone turns into powder. When the blade is cutting, powders it, and so it blows into the cancellous holes. Human and Starchild. You can see because the Starchild is so much denser, it makes more powder. That's basically it. So, if you take a piece of this and instead of cutting it, once you've cut it, if you take pliers and you snap off a corner, which you can do, snap it off, and now you get a nice clean edge. And if you're very careful, you can take lapidary tools like you use to polish jewelry, and you can polish that bone and you'll get a nice clear look at what's in the cancellous holes. Next slide. And what you see with human bone, this is the top, it's so big relative to the Starchild, this is the top, this is the inside. This is the same area, the same place, same piece. And it's pretty, it's like alabaster. It looks like a kind of a jewel of its own. This is human bone, normal human bone, after extended periods of death. Because what happens is in the natural course of events of life and death on this planet, Mother Nature cleans her plate, dust to dust. There are things that will eat every single aspect of us up till there will be nothing left. Nothing. There's a place in the States called the Body Farm in Tennessee where they've done extensive research on what happens to bodies. People donate their bodies and they put them out in the woods and they film what happens. And you can just see it's remarkable. Within a matter of a few weeks, you got a body laying there and you've got just a kind of a brown puddle of nothing. It's really incredible. Bones and everything. Get down to the bones, there's mold and fungi and bacteria that are going to eat that. Mother Nature cleans her plate. If she didn't, we'd be stepping out of here and we'd be looking at 1,000-foot high piles of bones. You have to understand that. Well, one of the things it does, there is a bacteria that we all carry that will eat out every single skerrick of bone marrow from our bones. Now, this is how bone works. It's like a sandwich. You got a piece of bread, and in the middle you have the cancellous holes where the marrow moves and is made and all that. Bone marrow, right? It's blood, in effect. A different kind of blood, bone marrow. So, what they do is they eat every bit of it out so much so that in the end, you could eat out of that. It's that clean. Nothing left in anybody ever. Next slide. Except for the Starchild, in which case you have this reddish residue all over the place. Next slide. We'll see a backlit piece. Look at it. No idea what it is, but it's not bone marrow. Because if it was bone marrow and it oxygenated, it would be black. You know how blood does? Blood falls, it oxygenates, it turns black. Whatever this is, it's not from Earth. It's not from Earth because Earth provides bacteria to eat every bit of it. We don't know what it is. Now people say to me, well, why don't you find out what it is? Why don't you find out what the fibers are? Why don't you find out what this is? It's very microscopic in size, all of it, number one. Number two, never been seen on Earth, so there are no protocols for recovery. Nobody's ever thought about trying to recover it before. But let's just say you could figure out how to recover it. How would you maintain the integrity of the samples that you recover? How would you get them and keep them pristine so that you could then test them? And then, because you're going to have to destroy them to do the tests, of all the thousands of tests you could run, what are you going to choose to run to destroy them? What are you going to do? You see the problems really compound when you look into doing it. And more important than all of it is, it costs an awful lot of money and we just don't have it. If there's one thing our field is famous for, it's no money. We can't access the money. The PhDs keep it all to themselves to do their stupid, flea research or what, I don't know if you ever read the crazy things they spend their money on, but nonetheless, we don't get it. They make sure we don't get it. And we have to scrounge around the way we do, and that's one of the ways they keep us down and out of the way of really bothering them. We'd love to know, and one day we will know. When it's appropriate and okay for science to deal with the Starchild, all of these things will be dealt with. Just like Otzi the Iceman, they've spent, $50 million on him over the years to find out everything they could possibly find out about him. The Starchild will be like that one day. Price will be no object. But not now, not until I ram it down their throats and they're forced to deal with it. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is basically just saying what I've been telling you, that the physical stuff just doesn't matter. But guess what? Recently, our geneticists recovered and sequenced several choice bits of clear-cut DNA evidence, and I'll share that with you now. This is quite a ride, and it is. Now, we're going to move into the DNA. Next slide.
Did you get that from the teeth?
The DNA? No. Bone. We can't. We're saving the teeth for the one that goes to film the final. So we just get it from the bone. But the Starchild's DNA is good. Okay, everything about the Starchild skull case comes down to DNA. Now, this is where you have to start learning some things. So I'm going to kind of go slow, and I'm not going to leave anybody behind. Don't worry. All of the cells in our body, trillions of cells, not necessarily all of them shaped like a basketball, but whatever their shape is, they have a nucleus, and outside the nucleus, floating in the cytoplasm, are what are called mitochondria. There's only one nucleus per cell, and there are hundreds to thousands of mitochondria floating in here, and the mitochondria are little power plants. Inside the nucleus is all of the chromosomes, And that comes from our parents, 23 from, in our case, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, that make up 3 billion base pairs, subunits, bases, nucleotides. We'll talk about all that in a minute. But so you have the chromosomes in here, 46 for humans, and they're made up of genes, about between 30,000 and 20,000 and 30,000. 30,000 max, 20,000. The lowest amount, somewhere in there. They're still figuring out what it is. But 20, 30,000 genes make up all these chromosomes, and each of the genes is made up of the spiral, the coiled double helix of DNA, and the DNA is made up of the key elements are the nucleotides, these bases, stuck together to make the steps of the ladder, and they produce the proteins. And we are our proteins. We make proteins. That's our gasoline. That's what we live on and move on. And also, there are power plants in the mitochondria, and they're producing power for us as well. That's what our cells do. They make the energy that lets us live. Next slide. We're going to see it in a different way. 46 chromosomes are composed of 30,000 genes, composed of 3 billion nucleotide bases arrayed in pairs. Again, that's in the nucleus, the 3 billion. And here's how it works. These things here, you have 4 bases, thymine, adenine, guanine, and cytosine. But these 4 always go together in pairs, i.e. base pairs. Thymine is always with adenine, adenine always with thymine, guanine is always with cytosine, cytosine always with guanine. So, you know how computers work with just 0 and 1? Does everybody know that computers work with only 2 basic symbols, 0 and 1? And from that infinite level of simplicity comes the incredible complexity of what computers can do, animations and all that stuff. It's all massive strings of 0 and 1. 0 and 1 is arranged in wild, weird combinations, but it boils down to 0 and 1. Same thing with us. 0 and 1. 0 and 1. DNA is the math of biology because of this. It all boils down to these 2 things. And you have that infinite simplicity blown out into the infinite complexity of our bodies, and not just our bodies, but the bodies of every living thing on earth and every living thing out there. It's incredible. It's incredible to know this. So you have that, and these make up the ladder steps here. And this, imagine, is the 20 or 30,000, the chromosomes, of course, the 46 chromosomes, 20, 30,000 genes wadded up inside the nucleus like wads of rubber bands. Just wadded up. But they're in there, and they're constantly churning, and they're constantly making themselves over, splitting, making new cells. It's mind-boggling when you really get to understand how our bodies work. It really is. Next slide. Okay, so here's how it works. Except the red blood cells, all of the cells have nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. And again, in the nucleus, where there's 3 billion base pairs, you have the chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad. But in the mitochondrion, which are floating out here in the hundreds to thousands, it all comes from mom. Now, how does that work? Because the egg, you've all seen pictures of the egg, how big it is relative to the sperm when it connects. The sperm is 23 chromosomes with a tail stuck on it. The egg is 23 chromosomes with all the mitochondria in there as well. So with the new person, it's got the mitochondria of the female. So all of us in this room, all of us, we have the mitochondria that our mothers have, that our grandmothers had, that our great-grandmothers had, right on back as far as you can go, with very little change over time. Mitochondria doesn't change very much over time. Now, there's an important thing you have to understand for the rest of this to make sense. In the 3 billion base pairs here in the nucleus, 3 billion, 95 to 97% of it doesn't work in a way that we understand. It doesn't make proteins. It is called junk DNA, non-coding DNA, non-functioning DNA. They're sorry they called it junk, like we're sorry we called it the Starchild, and they're trying to get away from junk, but still everybody knows it as junk DNA. 95 to 97% of this. So that all it's really making us operate is about 90 million base pairs. It's still a lot of room, but 90 million as opposed to 3 billion. Now with the mitochondrial DNA, it's different, exactly different story. There are only 16,569 base pairs. It's a very precise number. You can have 70, you can have 68, but nearly everyone who's everyone who's normal has this, and you don't want to be off normal. And it's a very precise number, 16,569. Now, with mitochondrial DNA, the same story is reversed. 95 to 97% of this works, and only a very small portion, 5 to 3% of it, does not work. And so, if you're going to have a mutation or a difference or a variation in here, and you're not in that 3%, you're going down if you're an embryo. You're not going to make it out. You're not going to be born. You've got to be normal in here, or if you have a variation, it's got to fall in that very narrow window to leave you alive and to let you push that into the gene pool of your haplogroup, whatever your haplogroup is going to turn out to be, because you now have a variation that's going to make a new haplogroup, or part of a new haplogroup. Stuff we'll talk about in a minute. So you can hit in here with mutations in that 95 to 97%, and it's not that bad a problem. Only when you get into the small portion that works, if you have a mutation there, do you begin to have problems. And guess how many we have? Over 4,000 genetic disorders in our gene pool, making us the most plagued with genetic disorder species there is. And that's for another lecture, but it's basically because we're genetically engineered. We're not a natural species on this planet. Anyway, next slide. That's my other work in human origins and hominoids and all that. This is an early gel sheet where the early part of DNA was where you were recovering with primers, 20 to 30 base pairs long, very tiny little strings, and you had to know what it was. Just understand that in the early days of DNA, it was the Stone Age compared to where it is now. Next slide. First DNA test done on the Starchild in late 1999 was done because there were 6 labs in the world that could handle what's called ancient DNA. Ancient DNA is dead longer than 50 years. Starchild was dead 900 years. So it was definitely ancient DNA. But to do ancient DNA, to handle it properly, because it's so fragmented, it's like, you remember the wad of rubber bands? When it's been dead over 50 years, those rubber bands have been put through a wood chipper, and you've got pieces the size of glitter scattered on the floor. And that's what you've now got to pick up and recover and figure out. You can do it, the machines can do it, computers can do it, but that's what you were up against back then. And this lab couldn't do it. It was a forensic lab. Those 6 labs could, because here's why. If a flake of skin off of one of the experimenters, a flake of skin hit the solution, ruined. If a droplet of their breath hit the solution, ruined. Right? It was like you had to work in a clean room. That's why there are only 6 labs that could do it. I wanted some kind of result, so I gave it over to these people. And they started out, I think, with the best of intentions. But in the end, other people on the campus found out what they were doing, and they just put pressure on them and said, get that thing out of here. Just get it out of here. And so, next slide. The report I got from them finally after 2 contaminations was a very weak result, 200 picograms, when 1,000 was normally what you would need. And they said the result is the XY chromosomes, which tell us the star child was a male and it's human. They were basically saying, go home and forget about this. This is dangerous. We can't fool with it. You shouldn't fool with it. Forget about it. And I said, you know, this can't be right. And they said, it is right, and we're going to put it out. Now, they again had already contaminated 2. This is another contamination. I don't even know if they even did it. I think they just wrote this because this was what the mainstream scientific community wanted to hear. And right now, to this day, again on Wikipedia, you will read them referring to this test right here from Bold in '99, saying that the child was male and that it was a human. You can read that as if it happened yesterday. As if it happened yesterday, in criticism of the Starchild. And so we were just absolutely floored. When this happened and the word went out, everybody, everywhere heard that the Starchild was a human, and that was it. Next slide. And so for the next 3 years, it was dead. I couldn't get anybody to listen to it.
Lloyd,
Yes?
who funded that lab? Who gave that information? Who were the main funders?
The owners of the skull, Ray and Melanie.
No.
The first lab was funded by Ray and Melanie. Yes. I'm getting to what you're referring to, I think. Okay, so the Starchild skull, 3 years dead time. I couldn't get anybody to listen to me at all. The mainstream overwhelmed me with the lies from that lab. That lab, I know, gave us a wrong result deliberately to get the mainstream off their necks. All right, so at the end of 2002, I had lived out of my pocket for this whole time. I couldn't make any money really. I had gone about $50,000 in debt, and I had to go bankrupt. And my girlfriend at the time said, you are crazy. Go back to who you were, go back to the hominoids, go back to the human origins. You can't keep doing this, you're killing yourself. And I would say, but I know what it is, I know what's right. And she would say, it doesn't matter, you can't beat them, they're too big, there are too many of them, you can't beat them. So I sent finally a letter out in November 2002 to the 1,500 or so people that were following me at that time, and I said, I've got to give it up, I can't do it. Ray and Melanie understood, everybody understood, I'd put my heart and soul into it, and I just couldn't do any more. And so then, next slide, the lady that I'm staying with right now in Highgate, London, Belinda McKenzie, raised the dead. She read that letter and she said, my dad recently died and I've come into some money and I'd like to help you do what you need to do. What would it cost? And I said, I don't even know. I gave up looking. I don't even know. She said, well, find out. Get me a number and let's see what we can do for you. And so what used to be 6 labs in the world that could do ancient DNA was now 24 labs. 24. And one of them was a new lab by 2 young men, next slide, called Rip and Molly and Jason Eshelman. And they formed Trace Genetics, and they said, if you're serious about this, we can get you an answer. Now, they look young, they're in their early 30s there, but they already had about 10 years of ancient DNA analysis under their belt. They had worked on the Kennewick man. These guys knew their stuff, and they had a lab that could do it. And they said, we will get you an answer if an answer is gettable out of your samples. And I said, great, let's do it. So they told me a price. I told it to Belinda, and we came to an agreement. And in July of 2003, they got the result. Now here's how it worked. Cut the bone. The cutting of the bone was amazing. They were just blown out at how hard it was. And so when they put it in, the standard thing you do with a piece of bone, of human bone, is you put it in a test tube and you put a sample of a liquid called EDTA on top of it. You put that test tube in a machine, it's called a rocker arm. It just holds it and it just rocks it back and forth like that. You've maybe seen them in labs, films of them, rocker arms. And you let it go for 1 week straight, and that will slowly, gradually dissolve the bone and leave the DNA intact as a little spidery bit. It looks like spider webs in there, little white spider webs. That's the DNA, that's what you're looking for. And then they go to work with that. They did that with the human bone found with the Starchild. In 1 week, there it was, DNA just perfect. With the Starchild, they put it in the same thing, rocker arm, 1 week, no change. A month, no change. 3 months, no change. I don't know when they turned it off finally, but they just wanted to see how far it would go. EDTA had no effect on it whatsoever. So what they did was they took another piece of the Starchild bone, they put it in a sample, and they have a very powerful detergent known as Tween 20. It'll dissolve cement, and it did dissolve the Starchild bone and got to its DNA. So when they were able to test it, they did. The human very quickly came up, first attempt, no problem. Starchild 2, first attempt, for mitochondrial DNA. Let's test mitochondrial first, it's easy. Next slide, human came up first. Very simple, right here, haplogroup A. These 4 right here mean haplogroup A. These 4 here in this array means haplogroup C. Well, what does that tell you? Starchild and the human found with it were not mother and child. And we had believed for a long time that it was a mother and child. And 203 proved, according to this, that they were not mother and child. But the Starchild did have a human mother, because that mitochondrial DNA was human mitochondrial DNA, or it looked like it anyway. At the time, the primers, remember we're talking primers, 20 to 30, and sometimes as much as 50 base pairs long, were pulling out little pieces saying it's human. It's all they could do in 203. That's all the technology they had at their disposal. So after they got the mitochondrial DNA, we knew its mother was a human. They said, okay, now we're going to go after the nuclear. Now you got to brace yourself, because the mitochondrial came up on the first attempt very easy. So this is looking like we're going to get a sample. And if it's human dad, then you've got a human on your hands, like it or not. So I was ready for that. I just wanted it over by then. It had been a long time. Next slide. But after 6 attempts, 6 full attempts to get its nuclear DNA, they could not get a recovery. Could not get a recovery. Now this is what the Bowl lab said they got. Nuclear DNA, male, human, remember? But here, these guys absolutely did. This is a forensic dental lab in Canada, used to dealing with just teeth and not dealing with ancient DNA. These guys are used to dealing with it, and they can't find it. So what that means is that absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, in 203, they proved that the 1999 test was just, as we say down home, flat-ass wrong. Just flat-ass wrong. Wrong as wrong gets. Wrong. Now, that should have been it for science. You know what science did? I started sending this out to all the people that had written, criticisms and people who were hammering us on the internet and all that. I said, look at the new test. Oh, no. We don't choose to believe this one. We choose to believe the first one. We think these guys made some kind of a mistake. We're not going to accept what we don't want to hear. We're going to live with what we want to hear. And that happened. So what it meant was, basically, if you can't get the dad, this should be a female hen and a male hen, but nonetheless, close as you can get, you got a human mother and a non-human father. That's what it looked like in 203 according to that test. So that's what we began to say. It was a hybrid. And I would say it must be a hybrid, and I would give these hybrid speeches, and I would always say the same thing, but it's a hybrid with a human mother and an alien father, but there's no sign of mom left. So I don't really understand how it worked, because there's nothing of mom left in it. You can't find any human in it. So I don't know how it's a human. I don't know how it's a hybrid with a human mother, but the DNA says so, the DNA wins. And that's what we were stuck with. But it was hard to explain. Then I said to them, well, what are we going to do now? What can we do? To Jason and Ripon. And they said, well, if you can wait 3 to 5 years, there's new technology coming online that's going to take the genome apart base pair by base pair, recover it base pair by base pair. And when it does that, it will get your missing nuclear DNA, because the primers we have are just for humans. And so they're not going to recover alien. They don't know what alien looks like. But when you can recover base pair by base pair, you will be able to tell exactly what it is. So it's like, okay, I'm looking at a jail sentence of 3 to 5 years. You know, the judge slammed gavel down, 3 to 5, depending on your behavior. That was it. Another 3-year jail sentence. However, it was exactly 3 years. Next slide. And in July 2006, the company that Jason and Ripon were referring to, that they knew about, that was processing, was called 454 Life Sciences, and they produced a machine that would indeed recover base pair by base pair. And those machines were immediately sent to the Max Planck Institute in Germany, Leipzig, Germany, to begin working on the Neanderthal, because that's something science wanted an answer to. They wanted the genome of the Neanderthal to understand if it was closer to primates or closer to humans, or what was it Neanderthal. This is something they want to know. So they applied, and all of this cost, by the way, millions of dollars. I mean, 10 or $15 million they've spent on that over the years. But the price, as these machines began to proliferate, the price was going down. And it was going from millions of dollars to $1 million to $500,000, and it was, you know, going down all the time. Well, just because I got to 3 years didn't mean I could afford it. It didn't mean at all. But at least I knew that if I waited long enough, the price would get down within range, reasonable range of doing something with it. Now, right now, today, the price of this has gone down so much today in 2012 that as we sit here in this room, if you took any of our DNA, our genomes, you could have your entire genome read out by one of these next generation machines by Illumina for $10,000, about 8,000 pounds, in that range. Your whole genome. If you wanted to do it, you could. You could hire it done. But understand, that is living. That, remember the rubber bands? That's the machines going in and breaking each rubber band very nicely and laying it out and laying it out and laying it out. They can do that because it's alive, nothing wrong with it. Remember, the Starchild's DNA has been put through the wood chipper and it's glitter on the floor. It's got to be put together piece by piece. So it's still going to cost $2 to $3 million to do it, because you have to run 50, 100, we don't know how many tests to get those little pieces of glitter stacked up, and then you run a compression program that puts them all together in one read. But you can do it. You can do it. Don't think you can. I know it's mind-boggling, but the Starchild's a pretty easy recovery because it was buried in a mine tunnel, no rain washing down on it to leach minerals into it, no sun beating down on it. It's well preserved. It's well preserved. But it is ancient. It is broken up into pieces, but the pieces are there. The pieces are recoverable. So, next slide. In early 2010, a new geneticist contacted me and offered to help. And here's how it happened. Guy contacted me and he said, look, I've read your Starchild Essentials ebook. My wife read it and my wife was impressed. A friend of hers had told her to read it. She read it. I thought when I first heard the story of the ancient skull, of the alien skull and all that, it was ridiculous. But he says, I've read your book, and he says, I have to say, you at least sound serious. And if you are serious, I have the capacity, because I'm the head of a major lab, of a major DNA lab here in the country, I have the capacity to tell you at least what you have. I don't have the facilities or the money to recover your whole genome for you, but I can shotgun it for some samples, and I can tell you at least if you're in the ballpark here. And I said, again, shove those chips right out to the middle of the table. Let's get this over with. Let it roll. And so I did. I sent him a sample. He broke it down. Next slide. And sure enough, within a matter of a few weeks, he had sequenced dozens of fragments of its nuclear DNA. But all were from the junk. All. But nonetheless, dozens, with hundreds of base pairs long, 200, 300, 400, 1,000, 2,000. It was incredible. For us, it was just like a mother lode. It was over 30,000 base pairs. in one run of shotgunning, over 30,000. Now, since he started, he's got about 50 million. But now that's still a very small fraction of 3+ billion. 50 million. It sounds big, but but still it's very telling what it was, because when he got it, the first thing you do is, remember in 2006 when it started, the people that put the money in these millions of dollars that it takes, scientists don't have that money. They have to get grant money from the US government through something called the NIH, next slide, the National Institute of Health in Maryland. And this is a $30 billion a year budget. And if you're a scientist and you want to test something, you want to get its genome, you apply to them for a grant, they give you the money, and you do it. Well, once these machines were available and proliferating around the country and the world, but particularly around the country, in the US, they were doing everything, anything, chimps, humans, people, gorillas, flowers, bacteria, everything they could think of, they were doing genomes. And the only deal was, is if the NIH put the money up, you had to send the results back to them. And so they have this giant database that by the time we were looking in middle 210, they had over 120 species types in there with literally millions and millions of coherent base pairs. So that if you're now a geneticist, like he was in the middle of 210, and you've got something new and interesting, you don't break your neck trying to figure out what it is. You just send it to the NIH and let them run it through the computers, and they send back and they tell you what the samples are, right? So he did that. He sent those dozens in and got back these kinds of reports. Next slide. For about half of them, they came back, these are called blast reports, this is what you get. They came back with that this 265 base pair fragment was found with a corollary on human sapiens chromosome 1 genome right. They know right where on the chromosome exactly it belongs. But don't let this fool you. This is not saying that the Starchild's DNA is human. It's human-like, okay? It's recognized as part of the DNA pattern on Earth. And it's recognized in this way. If it could just as easily, if he were asking, does it match up with chimps, he would have said yes. Because chimps are 97% the same as we are. Gorillas are 95% the same. Rats are 70% the same. That's why lab rats, they do a lot of testing because they're so like us genetically. Mice, another one, 65% the same. Pigs are similar as well. Yeast is 20%. Daffodils are like 45%? Everything shares the same life code here. So don't be fooled. It just means this is Earth-like, not human, but Earth-like, right? But the other half, next slide, the other half, the impressive part is that the other half, this one being a sample 342 base pairs long, came back, no significant similarity found. Not found in the database. And he said, Lloyd, look, if this was 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of these, I could live with that as just kind of a quirk. But to have it be half, he says, you really have something here. This is very, very unusual. And if you will let me, I'm going to now try to pursue this with a little more vigor and a little more energy to see what you might have. And that's when it started, and he's been doing that ever since. But understand that he has to do it on his own time, on the weekends, and out of his own pocket. Because when he talked to his administrators about this, and he said, what kind of support can I get from you guys? They said, not a damn bit. And if you let anybody find out that you're doing it or we're involved, you will be sacked probably. That's how it is, because the most conservative elements of science will drop down like a 2-ton tick on anybody that gets out of line when it comes to UFOs and aliens or Bigfoot or any of those things. Got to be very, very careful. So that's how he's been proceeding. And over time, he has been looking for, he also did a spectrophotometer test, and this is really cool too. It illustrates live wave absorbance in pure DNA. And this is what it looks like normally, pure DNA for humans. And no DNA is this, and protein contamination is that. Okay, so he did human and the Starchild. Next slide. And what you see, all right, human, just what it's supposed to look like. and that's the Starchild. And it's not no DNA, and it's not protein contamination. It's sort of struggling to kind of be a human, but it's just something else. It is just something else. So what the 3 billion base pairs, what he was looking for was, he said, I have to find a golden needle. He kept hitting in the 95% that was the junk. But he says, if I can get something out of that 3 to 5%, the golden needle in the 3 billion haystack, if I can get a fragment of that makes proteins, or even part of something that makes proteins, I can compare it to the human, which is well studied, and we'll really have something there. We'll really have a comparison we can make. I've got to find a golden needle. And he kept trying and he kept failing. But in that process, he found 4 fragments of the mitochondrial DNA. And this became very important. 4 fragments of mitochondrial DNA, because again, remember, the mitochondrial DNA is very well conserved. It doesn't change much over time. Next slide. Now, we know an awful lot about mitochondrial DNA. It's circular in shape. You have 15 genes in it, 2 RNA types, and then the rest normal genes. And they have extremely highly conserved because it undergoes little change over time. We know an awful lot about it. It's highly conserved. It stays the same. We know what. Now, next slide. Get this in mind. You have, of all the, if you had all 16,000, starting with number 1 here, right on through to 16,569 over there. This is just a little slice out of it, right? And among humans, you have 33 here, haplogroups. Some people say you have more and that new ones are developing all the time as they do more research. But let's just call it where it is for now. 33 haplogroups, Neanderthal and Denisova. And Denisova is the new pre-human that stands alongside Neanderthal. But they know very little about it because all they have is a finger bone. You've heard about the fingertip bone and the tooth. And they took DNA from that. It was found in a cave with Neanderthals, and they assumed it was Neanderthal, but they tested it because it looked a little different. They tested it and found out that, lo and behold, it had a different mitochondrial DNA count. And if it has a different mitochondrial DNA count, next slide, it's just different. And so what came out of that is that just because you have the finger bone in the tooth, you have a new species that stands alongside Neanderthals, and they know next to nothing about it. It's really kind of a pain in their neck to deal with it because they know so little, but they have no choice because mitochondrial DNA is like the law. If it's a different read from human or Neanderthal, it's a different species, period. Okay, next slide. So, let's go back to our 16,000 here on the wall, and we're going to take out this slice right here of 1255 of the 16 to 1350. This is 95 base pairs. They contain no variations in any of the haplogroups. And by the way, all of us sitting in here, we fall into one of these 33 haplogroups. We have the number of differences that make up the haplogroup. There could be 5 or 6 of us that share the same haplogroup and we have absolutely no relation to each other at all. But we fit in the haplogroups because the changes in our mitochondrial DNA are clocked and understood as such. And they're only a maximum of 120 allowed. 120 allowed. And those 120 come from black Africans in South Africa. They were the first humans. And as just a sidelight, I always mention that Zecharia Sitchin wrote in The 12th Planet in 1976. 1976, he wrote that the first humans were genetically engineered in South Africa to be slaves and servants as the Adamu, the black-headed ones, the black people, whatever you want to call it. He wrote this in 1976, and in 1986, the mitochondrial Eve program showed that indeed humans were about 200,000 years old, and the first of us did indeed come from South Africa. What Sitchin wrote in 76 to just tremendous ridicule and disparagement by everybody in the mainstream, 10 years later, they prove he's absolutely right. Do you think he received a single apology from anyone? From his own lips? No, never heard a word from anybody. Never heard a way to go, never heard a congratulations. Never heard you win, nothing. Forgot about it. True story. Anyway, so this is the way most of this on the wall would look. Most of it would look that way. There's very little change, but there are changes. Next slide. There are changes, and this is what they look like. The computer will let you know. In this haplogroup, everything is a T except this is a C right here. And the computer does these lines and things to let you know, pay attention, we got a difference here. Next slide. It can also be that something will be missing. This has a G here, this has nothing here. So it puts in the bar space to let you know whether it's on this one or on this one, and it lets you know. And there are differences. Now, next slide. We're going to look at a segment 164 base pairs long from 1202 to 1426. That's 164 base pairs long. And in this one, you see one change in the human right here, one change in the Neanderthal right here, and one change in the Denisova, the two different Denisovas, same change right here. So it's 1, 1, 1 in the three different species. You with me? Now, it just so happens that this 164 is the smallest of the 4 fragments that our geneticists recovered of the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA. The smallest fragment. So what is allowed here is 1 difference. Next slide. In the Starchild, there are 17. Now, right here is enough to show the Starchild is not human, and not just is it not human, it is radically not human. Just right here. But there's more. Next slide. When you total it all up, what you see is humans, the 120 that I told you, and Neanderthals are 200. We're all less than 120. All of us sitting in this room, we're 60, 70, 80, 90, something like that. But we're not up to 120. Nowhere near it. That's for the blacks in Southern Africa, the first of us. We're all more recent than them. Neanderthal around 200, 25, 199, could be like that. Denisova, 385. And that's why they had to call it a new human. Look at this. This is only 80 between us and Neanderthals. It's 185 between these two. They're not even very much alike. They're very different. And chimps out at 1500. So you see what the gap is here. It's huge. Next slide. With the Starchild, the 4 fragments have 1,583 base pairs. That is 9.5%, almost 10%. Ask any statistician. That is mathematically significant. Mathematically significant. You can project off of that. You can extrapolate off of that. And you get, if you do, in the 1,583 base pairs, there are 93 variations. Already 93 on the way to 120. And if you extrapolate that, you get out to 883.5. So you know the Starchild is going to be 700% different out to 800 to 1,000, somewhere in there. But you know what the mainstream said when we started trying to put this out there? Well, wait a minute. You can't say for sure that every other thing in there, every other fragment, is not going to be perfectly clean with no changes, and you end up with a 93 variations, and so it could still be human. With 4 fragments showing 93, they wouldn't let us say that we could extrapolate, because you can't be sure that there would be any more changes. So while the mitochondrial DNA should have been a home run, it wasn't, because we just fell within that window of the 120. We didn't get outside the window. We didn't get enough fragments. One more fragment would have put us over. We haven't gotten it yet. But the 4 are enough to know. So we were stuck. And then one day, you remember the golden needle? Remember the golden needle? He calls me up and he says, you remember the golden needle? Next slide. And I said, oh yeah. He says, guess what? And I said, you got a golden needle? He says, no, man, no. I have a diamond needle. I got much better than a golden needle. I got a diamond needle. I said, well, what's that? In every human embryo, a gene called forkhead FOXP2, or FOXP2, you may have heard this term before, is a master gene controlling embryonic growth in at least 300 other crucial genes. What the FOXP2 does is it basically develops your core, your brain, your throat, your trachea, your lungs, your heart, your guts, your core. Now, FOXP2 is what this master gene means is it controls at least the downward flow activity of 300 other genes. At least 300. Some people think it's as much as 1,000. But what does that mean? If something goes wrong in FOXP2, that ripple effect down is catastrophic. So as the embryo is developing, if there is a flaw, if there is a variation, if there is a change, if there is a mutation in FOXP2 in any of its base pairs, the embryo dies. The embryo dies. And a lot of embryos die. I don't know if you know the statistics, but it's staggering how many don't make it because of things like this. She's shaking her head, so she must know. All right, anyway, next slide. The FOXP2 is 2,594 base pairs long. 2,594. It is one of the most highly conserved genes in our bodies, way more than mitochondrial DNA, where you can get up to 120 changes there. In FOXP2, every normal human has exactly the same. Every one of us in this room has the same string of base pairs, all 2,594. There are people walking the earth who have one difference in one of those. One difference, and they never speak. Never speak. Takes out their voice. 2, can't have. 3, can't have. 4, can't have. You're dead. FOXP2 is one of the most highly conserved genes in our bodies. Is everybody getting this? This is important to understand. Next slide. A 211 base pair fragment of Starchild FOXP2 is compared to the exact same 211 base pairs in humans and in several other species. Rhesus monkey, mouse, dog, elephant, possum, chicken, a type of frog, and zebrafish. And you see the similarities because everything has a FOXP2. Everything has a variation of FOXP2. It's one of the most important genes on Earth, not just in our bodies, on Earth. And it better work because it has all that downstream effect. It has to be the same. And if you look at the human, sure enough, every one of us in this room would have exactly this 211 base pair fragment. If you pulled it out of us, it would line up exactly, letter for letter, with that piece right there. Now look at the Starchild. How many red differences do you see, do you think? Next slide. 56. 56. Nothing allowed for humans, Neanderthal, Denisova. You get to a rhesus monkey, you have 2, a mouse 20, dog 27, 21 for elephant, possum 21, frog 26, Starchild 56. 56. Its base pair fragment says 56, that's 8% of the total. Again, mathematically significant, 8%. Extrapolate that out and you get 700 total. This is a fragment and they have 56. None allowed, and 700 in the range is what's going to be in the Starchild's total. Now, the best way to analogize it is this. If you're a human, FOXP2, your area code is here in England. You're a human. You're a Neanderthal, you're over to France. 200. Remember, you're over to France. If you're a Denisova, you're over to Japan. 385, pretty far away, you're over to Japan. What's the area code of the Starchild? The moon, right, exactly, the moon. That's it, the moon. He got it. It's absolutely that staggeringly different. It is overwhelming, it really is. It's so overwhelming, next slide, that our geneticist decided that with the strength of that, he went back to his bosses at the lab and he says, look, we have it. I want to start applying for grants. I want to come out of the woodwork to the extent that I apply for grants, confidentially of course, but apply for grant money to try to get this paid for. And I said, great idea. And they said, yeah, okay, go for it. We can see it as well as you can. So he wrote an abstract as part of the grant. And when I saw the abstract, I said, you know, it doesn't mention who you are. It doesn't mention the lab. Could I put it on the website? And he said, yeah, sure, go ahead. And you can go on the website and you can read it. Don't think you're going to understand it, but you can read it. Because it's written in scientific language for other scientists who will get it. And so, put it up there, and just before I came on this trip, I got an email from one of the top geneticists in America working in California. And he said, I'm going to be speaking at Oxford and Cambridge and all these places in England while you're there. I'd like to meet with you because someone sent me that abstract. And he says, if that's true, and I said, it's true. He said, if that's true, you guys have this in the bag. You're going to win this. You know that, don't you? And I said, absolutely, we know it. he said, I want to talk to you about it. So on September 7th, which just happened to be my birthday in Manchester, we had a 3-hour dinner meeting at Michael Caine's restaurant, of all things. Not the Michael Caine, the famous chef Michael Caine. But anyway, it was cool. On his nickel, of course. I couldn't even, couldn't get a burger there. But anyway, the point is, we had a great meeting. I explained to him the background and the story and how it had all evolved and all this. And he says, I'm going to need to stay in the background initially here, but I'm going to work for you guys and I'm going to see what I can do for you. I want to get together with your geneticist. I'm going to try to bring some of my friends on it. And look, they've been working hammer and tong to try to get it done. He had to take time the last week or so for another lecture tour, but these guys are working on it. And he's brought in a third one that's going to meet next week when I'm back there. I'm leaving on Wednesday to go back, and we're going to have a meeting as soon as possible with the third one. It's starting to snowball. It's going to happen because it is real, it is legitimate, and the FOXP2 is enough to show anybody that knows that this is the real deal. Because it's like a piece of a puzzle, but it's there. It's a real piece. It isn't a mistake piece. It's there. You don't pull them out unless they're there. The machine doesn't screw around with them like people can do. It doesn't put a flake of skin in the solution or a drop of breath in the solution. The machine just doesn't care. It just reads what's there again and again. It's the math of biology, 2 + 2 = 4. We win. It's just now not a question of if, it's now just a question of when. When they can get it lifted, its profile high enough to attract investment to it, we're going to make history at a staggering level. Next slide. At the same level of these guys. In the 1500s, these guys moved the earth from the center of everything out into the position that it really belonged in. The conceit of the 1500s was that the earth was the physical center of the universe, the physical center of everything. And they had to give that up. And that was a hard thing to give up. And now, with the Starchild, what you're going to do is have to give up our conceit that we are the biological center of the universe. It's going to be as big as this over time. Next slide. It's going to be equivalent to the Wright brothers. In 1900, at the turn of the century, a poll was sent out to everyone, over 200 of the main wizard scientists of the world at that time, asking them a series of questions about the future. One of which was, do you think that humans will ever be able to fly in heavier than air machines? And 95% of them wrote back, no, that's impossible. The physics are all wrong, and here's why. And you gave all this scientific gobbledygook. While two brothers are in Dayton, Ohio, working in a bicycle shop, and in 3 years they're going to fly. And they do. Because they weren't invited into the poll. They didn't even know the poll was happening. They were just doing it. Doing it. They weren't paying attention to the scientists who said it couldn't be done. They were doing it. Next slide. And this put us all, rest in peace, put us all on our first step toward our inevitable future in space. And what the Starchild's going to do, next slide, is move us into our membership in a galactic community. It's going to make us become part of a larger community out there. It's going to make us see ourselves for what we really are in the same way the people in the 1500s had to do it. Is it going to be easy? No, it's not. Because there are a lot of people out there that are very conservative in their viewpoints and want everybody to live the way they did when they were children. Can't be that way. We have to move forward all the time into the future, and the Starchild's going to take us there. Next slide. Anyway, maybe the Starchild heralds a new beginning that we have all heard 2012 might bring. This could be it. We all keep hearing about 2012, 2012. If we get funded before this time, which could happen, maybe it's the Starchild that's going to be the change of consciousness that everybody keeps talking about, or the big change. Not going to be a disaster. There's no comet out there or anything. Just hold it. We're almost done here. Next slide. Trying to get done. How long will it take to prove the Starchild's case beyond all doubt? Until we find someone who has sufficient money and curiosity and courage to join us making it happen. When we do find that person, every human's life will change in ways we really can't imagine right now, but I am certain those changes will be right and true and good. I see it on the lights, the positive side. I think that we can't be helped by anybody until we acknowledge that they're there. Why would they bother with us as long as we're infants crawling around on the floor with dirty diapers? We have to stand up. We have to become mature enough to say, okay, we know you're there. We could use some help. Come down and help us fix this mess we've made of this place. And I think maybe at that point they might do it. But not until. Next slide. So those of you who are interested in learning more about this and the details that I can give you in this lecture, there is an ebook, and I keep the price low so it's easy to get. If you want to know more about my human origins and hominoids, there's this one, which is a much bigger book, but they're all ebooks. They're designed as ebooks, heavily illustrated, and the reason I prefer this form is that I can make changes to it so easily, and I can keep it fully updated all the time. You can't do that with a print book. So I make it as easy for you to access this information as I can, and it's good information, and I encourage you all to get it if you can. Otherwise, that's the end of it. This is where you clap.